Well, I got to tell you, this city is full of antiques. English, French, and even some Italian pieces. Now, the owner of this shop recently purchased this table in Nice, part of southern France. However, she tells me that she thinks it was crafted by an Italian cabinet maker in the early 19th century. Seems to show the features of Italian furniture. It's made out of walnut. The top is beautiful. One board across the top, nice and clear. Full-size drawer across the front, and some tapered legs. However, the tapered legs are a little unusual. They're tapered on the outside, unlike most of the pieces we've built, which have the taper on the inside. Now, this table is just about the right size to fit behind a sofa or in a hallway. And I guess you could even use it as a desk. Let's see how much she wants for it. Oh, boy. $3,950? I think it's time to sit down and haggle a bit. I'd also like to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools safely will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now I'll show you how I built today's project. When it came time to size our library table, I thought that 48 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 30 inches high would be just about right. Now, when I built this piece, I tried something I hadn't done before. Notice that the rail and the draw fronts have pretty much matching grain. And that's because all the pieces were cut from one single piece. Actually, the rail is made from 5 pieces. There's a top strip, a bottom strip, and a block in the middle that's been glued in there, as well as a block on each end. Now, to make that rail, I started out with a piece of 1x8. And the first thing I did is lay out for that center block. And I ran the lines all the way across the board to key everything together. Eventually, I'm going to end up with about 7 pieces of wood, and I want to make sure I keep them properly oriented. First thing I want to do is cut the bottom rail and the top rail. Boy, the joiner does a nice job dressing up that edge. Okay, so far we've got 3 pieces. And now what I want to do is key the draw fronts so they don't get confused later. So I'm just going to number them, a 1 for this draw front and a 1 on the top rail. I'm going to put an arrow to make sure I keep the top edge in the right place. And this one can be number 2. Now the next thing to do is cut this center block out. And I'll do that at the radial arm. Now, from the 2 long pieces that are left over, measuring from where I just cut the center block, I'll cut a couple blanks for the draw fronts. I'm going to make those 15 inches, which is a little longer than what I need. Here are the pieces that I've cut so far. And if I was going to use a flush draw front, I could pretty much glue it together right now. But I want to use an overlay draw, which means it's going to lap the opening about 1/4 of an inch. So I have to reduce the height of this opening. So I'm going to thin down these blocks. I'm going to rip some material off the top edge. I want the grain to match almost perfectly on the bottom because that's where you're going to see it the most. If it doesn't match up here, that's okay. Okay, another adjustment to the rip fence. 3 1/4 inches is the height I want for those blocks. Now, with all the blocks cut, I'm going to put them in the right location and lay out the length of my draw opening so I can locate the end block. Now, the opening is 14 inches, but I'm going to hold my tape on 15 inches and mark at the 1-inch indicator because that's more accurate. With age, the tips on these tapes get loose and sometimes bent, so they're not very accurate. Okay, now all I have to do is put two rail pieces together, align them with my center marks, and square across. Now, to reinforce all the joints between the strips and the blocks, I'm going to use some of these compressed beechwood biscuits, 2 at every location. And so that they don't stick into my drawer openings, I'm just going to take an actual biscuit, put it where I want it, and draw a line across the joint for the cut. A little bit of glue on the biscuits, and then I set them in the slots. Now we could do some assembly. Just slip the pieces together. You'll notice that I'm not putting all 3 blocks in at once, one at a time. Ability in these long rails to open it up to fit the block in. And now I just clamp it with a little bit of clamp pressure. Okay, now I can pop this middle one in and clamp that in place. Now the block on the other end. Okay, that takes care of the rail. I can set this aside to dry. But while I have all the tools out to do glue-ups, let's make the top. Now the top is made out of 3 1x6s, and as you've seen me do numerous times, I straightened them, edge jointed them, cut the slots for the biscuits, and now I'm just gluing it up. Now with 2 clamps underneath the top, I'm going to place the last one over the top and in the center. And what that does is it stops the piece from buckling as I apply pressure. Okay, that's enough pressure. Now I can set this aside to dry and start working on the legs. Now you'll notice that the legs on the table have been tapered along the inside edges. And what that does is adds gracefulness and elegance to the table. Now what I like to do first to the legs is make the mortises into which the tenons for the rails will fit. The first thing is to make blanks, and they were made from 8/4 stock, ripped and planed, so that I end up with a piece 1 5/8 by 1 5/8. Then I cut them to length, which is 29 1/4 inches. Now I like to pay attention to the grain. On the table leg that I'm going to see, the front side, I want to use the surface grain, not the edge grain. So when I lay out the mortises, I'm careful to place them in the right location. Here are the marks for the front rail, and here are the marks for the end rail. Now we'll make those mortises over on the drill press. I'm going to taper the legs using my homemade tapering jig. And how it works is, as you slide it along the rip fence, it'll cut a taper. You can see we start at about 2 inches, and as I get to the other end, it's about 7/8 of an inch. Now with the blank set in it, the important thing to do is to keep the blank up against this back stop and to make sure you keep the whole jig riding parallel and against the rip fence. Now you also notice that the taper does not start at the top of the blank. It actually starts about 6.5 inches down. And that's because I don't want to taper the portion with the mortise. I'll just use the joiner to smooth up those tapers. Well, now I'm going to turn my attention back to the front rail. I think the glue has had sufficient time to set up, and I can unclamp it. Now I can just scrape off any of the excess glue, and now I'll sand it all smooth with my sander. Now I'm ready to cut the rails, and I'm going to add 3/4 of an inch to each end to allow for the tenons that'll fit in those mortises I made in the legs. Now to cut the tenons in the end of my rails, I've set up a couple things at the table saw. First, my stacked dado head cutter. And then I've attached this wooden auxiliary fence to protect the blade from hitting the metal rip fence. I took a piece of stock the same thickness as my cherry and ran a sample tenon for its thickness to see how it fits. Well, that's good. Now I'll run the cherry. Now, without changing anything except the height of the blade, which I've now raised to 1/2 inch, I cut the remaining edges of the tenon. And that should fit just about right. That's good. While the dado head is set up in the saw, there's a couple more things I want to do. So I've taken the top off of the prototype to show you. At the top of all the rails, there's a dado. And that picks up these corner blocks and also this strip of wood right here, which prevents the drawer from tipping out as it's opened. Also, there's a dado at the back rail and the front rail along the lower edge to hold the lower draw guides. I've adjusted the dado for 3/16 of height, and for the first dado I want to be 1 inch to the far side of the blade. And that's good. Now I'm just going to move the fence over to 1 1/4 inches, and that'll be set up to run the dados along the bottom edge of the long rails. Along the bottom edge of all the rails, I've put a little bead, really just for decorative purposes. I make the bead using my router table, which is set up with a little beading bit. I've also installed this feather board to keep the stock tightly up against the fence. Okay, now it's time for some assembly. I've applied some glue to the tenons and to the inside of the mortise. And I'm simply going to slip it all together and clamp it. Well, it's coming along now. Well, now's the time to put in all the cross pieces. So a little bit of glue at each location and some glue on the end of the piece. Set it up. Then fasten it in place with some 1-inch brads. These pieces are the supports for the drawer. They're also glued and nailed in place. Now each drawer support gets this little cleat, which is a side guide, preventing the drawer from moving side to side. And now for the corner blocks. And they're also glued and nailed in place. This top has had plenty of time to dry, so I'm going to unclamp it, scrape off any excess glue, and give it a nice smooth sanding. With this end squared up, I can now measure for my length, which is going to be 48 inches. Now these cross strips and the corner blocks are used to fasten down the top. And you'll notice that I've drilled some holes for the screws. And as I drill them, I move the drill back and forth to elongate the hole. And that's so the top will be able to move freely across its width with changes in temperature or humidity. I'll secure the top in place using some 1 5/8" bugle head screws. I've made the chamfer on the edge of the tabletop just using a chamfering bit in the router. The drawers on our table are overlay drawers. The cherry front overlaps the face frame by about 3/8 of an inch all the way around. The sides, the back, and the bottom are made from a cabinet maker's type of plywood. It's has a nice finish to it so you can stain it or paint it. Now, unlike typical plywood, which has 5 or 7 laminations, this has 9 laminations. It's a very stable material. Now, I'll start building the drawers by working on the drawer fronts. And over here I have the pieces that were left over from making the face frame. I want to size these, making them a 1/2 inch longer than the drawer opening and 5/8 of an inch wider than the drawer opening. Now, with the drawer fronts cut to size, I'm ready to rabbet out the edges where it'll overlay the face frame. Now, I could do that on the table saw with the dado head cutter, but I'm going to use my router with a rabbeting bit. I'll make the rabbet in 2 passes since that's an awful lot of material to remove with a pass. I've just finished setting up my table saw to make this joint right here, a dado at the back edge of each side piece to hold the drawer back. Now, I've set up my dado head cutter in the table saw, a stacked dado head, installed a guide block, and I use the guide block whenever I use my miter gauge to push the work through, because if the work touches the rip fence, you could get some kickback. Now, I've readjusted my fence and changed the thickness of the dado to 1/4 inch, and I just made a groove and a side piece which actually holds the plywood bottom on the drawer. Okay. Now, when I assemble the drawer, I'm also going to need a dado along the inside of the drawer front to hold the plywood bottom. And all I have to do to make that dado is move the rip fence over the amount of the overlay rabbet, which is 3/8 of an inch. You've often seen me join my drawer sides to the front with a dovetail joint. If you don't happen to have a dovetailing jig, you might try this joint. It's called a rabbeted lock joint. All it really is a small dado in the side, and you mill the front so that you have a tab that will lock it together. I start out with the rabbeted front like this. And the first thing that I want to do is make a cut right up against the rabbet so that I end up with a little tab right down here. Okay, now I'm just going to move my rip fence away from the blade, the thickness of the blade, or about 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm just going to adjust my rip fence to about 5/8 of an inch and lower the blade so only about 1/4 of an inch is sticking up and trim off that tab. All right, I just made a sample for the side piece dado to see how it fits. And that's pretty good. Now that was made just with a single saw blade and the rip fence. Now the dado is just a little bit wider than my blade, so I got to move it over just a bit, maybe a 32nd of an inch. Okay, now on the draw front I've put a chamfered edge for decorative purposes. You could make that with a router and a chamfering bit, but you'd have to set up a router table. I'm just using my joiner. I've tilted the fence to 45 degrees, and 4 passes through on each edge gives me the look I want. Okay, now the sides are joined to the front with some glue and brads. And the bottom just gets slipped into the dados. No glue here. And all I need to fasten it with is a couple brads along the back edge. And with that done, I guess it's time to start thinking about what kind of finish I want to put on this piece. Now, I've chosen a Danish oil finish for our table. And most of the Danish oils that are on the market contain some solvents. And that emits vapors, which could be harmful if you breathe them for too long. And also, if you leave rags that are soaked in the material hanging around, you could risk some spontaneous combustion. Now, this formulation is actually a water-based type of Danish oil. And it's non-flammable, has no real odor, and it does the same thing as a real Danish oil. It seals the pores in the wood and protects it. Now, all I really have to do is squeeze a little bit of the oil onto my rag, rub it into the wood in a circular motion, just like a hand rub finish, and then just even it all out by going straight with the grain. Now, it's possible to get this Danish oil with pigment already in it for a little different color or to match your wood. But here I'm using a clear finish. And that's because this cherry will darken all on its own. Now, this dries pretty quickly, and it's recommended to put on 2 or 3 coats, one every half hour. And that should do the job. One of the things that I like about an oil finish like this is that the more coats you put on and the older the piece of furniture gets, the better it looks. It's not a bad piece.